Another plan change.
Chair, such is the work of the Regional Planning Committee. Is Rena with us? No. Oh, sorry. The author of the paper is in Perth, so Gavin, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, okay. So last month, the Regional Planning Committee members will recall that you received a presentation from staff indicating some tentative milestones and timeframes for the preparation of an oil and gas plan change. We've done some further work on those timeframes and milestones, and that's outlined in the paper here. But probably the most critical part of this report in front of you today is the presentation of some preliminary draft legal advice that we obtained from Simpson Greason regarding the question of basically whether a prohibition on oil and gas activities in parts of the region is justifiable under the RMA. So a full copy, after some toing and froing about legal privilege and whatnot, a full copy of that legal advice is set out in attachment 1, and it pretty much responds to 3 key questions that are outlined in paragraph 6 of the paper. In a nutshell, it basically says the council does have the ability to introduce a prohibition for oil and gas activities in parts of the region, but it clearly signals that the plan change would need to have clear and robust justifications and certainly the evidence to do so. Some of that justification and the evidence will naturally flow from the drafting and the consultation processes in the early stages of this plan change project. And it might be that the current proposition to prohibit oil and gas activities in some locations might actually need some tweaking or exemptions or some fine-tuning along the way. It might be that some activities might not be prohibited. There might be some sort of other classification within our regional plans. The process and the drafting stages will potentially reveal that. So I just wanted to flag to you that, yep, in a sense, the council does have the ability to introduce these prohibitions that the planning committee has spoken of in the past couple of meetings, but it needs to be mindful that it needs to be robustly justified and have the evidence to do so. I'm happy to attempt to respond to any questions around the legal stuff.
Thank you, Gavin. Do we have any questions first? Thank you, Finn.
Through you, Chair, thank you. Just can you give us an example of what those issues may be and how easy or otherwise they are to justify?
From the legal perspective, or the
physical evidential justification for putting a prohibition on?
Okay. I think last meeting I gave the example that certainly with the RMA having this effects-based philosophy, and it's relatively agnostic to what sort of activity has an effect compared to how another activity with a similar effect is managed. The example I gave was if seismic surveying is undertaken by New Zealand Transport Agency in design works for a bridge over a river, how are the impacts of seismic surveying on the nearby environment potentially any different to seismic surveying being undertaken by a petroleum company? Very little. So the seismic surveying is certainly an investigation kind of phase of things. That might be treated and managed differently as opposed to the petroleum company following through and abstracting resources from the ground, perhaps. But that's another phase of works, another package of environmental impacts that our plan could choose to manage.
Just to be more specific, Chair, the actual effects of of exploration or drilling or whatever it may be, if the mitigation is seen as, effective, meets national thresholds, meets a whole lot of international obligations, etc., and that can be proven, or that there is, how do I say it, a real evidence that actually the risk is there, but actually has been very well managed, can a prohibition still come in and be defendable going forward?
It's a bit of a thorny one. It is, yeah, yep. And do you want to take a fairly staunch precautionary approach across the entirety of the region or across every individual circumstance that might come up, or would you still prefer to sort of leave yourself, or resource users, the option of maybe applying for a non-complying activity resource consent and assessing that on its individual specific locational circumstances? With a prohibition, no one can apply for a resource consent. They can't have their own specific proposal put in front of you, full stop.
Can I perhaps just add that, look, the oil and gas sector has taken great notice of the decisions taken to date with respect to this. They're coming to town to visit us shortly to have discussions. You can have every expectation that, given that this will be seen as the thin end of the wedge, that this will be contested aggressively legally, and it will be a complex exercise where experts will be put up against experts around the minutiae of things like how well casing is designed and managed, and how hydraulic fluids and what have you can or cannot be contained proximal to water bodies. What we really want, the key message we want you to understand with this, is that this will be a hell of a fight. It's going to be really expensive, it'll be litigated to hell, and it'll be drawn out. Now, I'm not saying that there's any reason not to do it, because the values of the community that you've represented at this table have been quite clear and quite strong, and so we're up for it, but just don't think it's going to be quick, and don't think it's going to be easy, and don't think it's going to be cheap.
So final question, Chair. So what are we talking here? 7 figures? 1 million ratepayer dollars? What are we talking?
Well, it's very, very hard to estimate that at the outset, because it all depends on the analysis that we've yet to do. So we've said indicatively that we could prepare advice for a plan change and get that notified up to within the $145,000 that was set aside for energy-related issues. That there's no provision in that for ongoing litigation, and that will simply have to be taken, when the time comes. And it may be that the council decides to withdraw its position at that point because it doesn't want to spend the money, or it might decide to reprioritise and find the money. The analysis will throw up a whole range of areas of technical complexity and concern for you to consider in deciding whether or not to proceed with notifying a plan change. So we'll have a much better sense of that once we've done this work, but certainly you can count on probably some hundreds of thousands of dollars expended on this exercise. I think that's a fair call.
It is a question. Given that you have indicated to council that the oil companies are coming to town and are basically making it very clear that they're going to take us to task in every way, shape or form they can do. In other words, they are a threat, threatening us. Isn't it true that the limits of a tyrant are determined by those they seek to tyrannise?
Not sure whether that was really a question, but look, I just in respect, what I would like to say though is that they won't articulate their position until they really understand where we're going with this. So they'll be interested in seeing the analysis that's undertaken, and it's my expectation that they will, they will be more than happy to make undertakings that they're not going to drill in places like the middle of Lake Waikaremoana, for example. But they'll be looking at the fine detail, and they'll be looking at the precedent-setting effect nationwide, because this is about case law. And once a plan change gets across the line, it gets litigated, and a judge, and who knows, this could go to the Supreme Court. At that point that it's settled, that then is the bar that they will then have to work to in every other region. So there's a lot at stake for them, which is why I would expect them to, be very active in this process.
Clearly, everybody else will be pausing at the moment and also have Churchillian statements that they wish to make on this. So I just want to, before we do that, are there any more questions? And we'll, yeah, I know, but it was also what's on a lot of people's minds around this table, I imagine. Any other direct questions? Otherwise, we will move. I'll look for a mover.
I have a question.
Yes, a question.
James, the budget of $150,000, I understand, will cover a planning contractor and perhaps some legal advice, but we're required to have robust science and evidentiary basis to back up our proposed plan change. What's factored in the $150,000 to cover that?
So it does include a contract for technical advice on the management of the risks, but the level of analysis that we will get for the sum set aside relative to what will be required to meet the threshold through a litigated process, if you like, it remains to be seen. So until we get that technical advice, we don't really know how deep we'll need to go. One of the choices this committee will need to make is whether it seeks more advice or notifies on the basis of the information it has to hand. And it may well be that you determine that a relatively superficial analysis is sufficient and you want to proceed on that basis, and then we would have to decide how much additional evidence and expertise we'd want to contract in the event that we were in an appeal situation through the courts.
Council or other authorities attempted to create such.
So Hastings District Council has proposed something in their district plan recently regarding oil and gas activities over the unconfined aquifer, Heritonga Plains aquifer. And I'm aware that Gisborne District Council has proposed something in their recent combined plan. Bearing in mind that Gisborne District Council is a unitary authority, so they do district and regional functions, I haven't familiarised myself as to whether their oil and gas regulatory rules fall into the regional parts of the plan or the district parts, but there's just some subtlety. So, yeah.
It's comprehensive.
Certainly at this end of the spectrum it would be, yep. And then just as you were following up with that question, the other thought that came to mind is you've got the likes of Taranaki councils who probably operate at a different end of the regulatory spectrum, and they more enabling than what we currently propose.
Just noting in Taranaki, it is a permitted activity or controlled activity, so with rules, but it's not a discretionary activity to drill for oil and gas. So you've got a precedent where another regional council has set the bar quite low, albeit with a whole bunch of controls that exist. So we're up against that because that will be used as evidence in court, if you like.
Tom.
I'll come back to you, Tom. Three questions about the same issue here. In the case of Hastings, do we know what the legal authority is under which they have acted to take that position? Is that also RMA grounded, or where is that grounded?
It is an RMA basis that they've used, yep.
And has anybody actually challenged it at this point?
I'm unaware of any legal challenge on that one.
So,
So
why?
that
It's the unconfined aquifer and its activities on, and there are a whole range of activities that are precluded, such as holding hazardous substances. So the way their concern is framed is that if you have an oil and gas production facility sitting on top, it's akin to having a chemical factory down a Mahu Road on the unconfined aquifer, and so I don't think that's particularly controversial with the industry.
So they're still dealing with an effects-based
Very much so.
basis. So my last question then is, do we as a council have any other legal basis on which we can approach an issue like this, or is it strictly RMA?
To my mind, the only other way is as a landowner, but that landowner portfolio is relatively confined compared to the spatial areas that we're talking about here, being surface water bodies, aquifer recharge zones, and aquifer systems. So as a landowner, we might be able to say, no, we'll close the gate to such and such petroleum exploration activities, but yeah, our land holdings aren't as diverse as and far-reaching as what this RMA power might enable us to be.
That's coming, are they representative? Are they representatives of a number of oil companies, or are they a specific oil company?
So the visit that we
Who
have,
are they?
the visit we have coming is from the Petroleum Exporters and Producers Association of New Zealand. So it is the industry organisation on behalf of the sector. And look, at this point in time, they're coming to understand what's proposed and why we're doing it. And as per our original advice to you last year on this, if the proposal was confined to aquifers and aquifers only, there's a good chance that the industry would say, well, we don't want to buy that fight and we'll leave it. But the more we've got into surface water bodies, adjacent to surface water bodies, and then into catchments and recharge zones, the more and more it's taken out more and more of the region, and the precedent just gets bigger and bigger. And so that's part of the calibration exercise for you to do. And the advice that we'll bring forward, both technical and legal, will give the relative kind of risks and merits of how far you go on all of this. And again, if you went to a whole region-wide prohibition, carte blanche, then you'd be in some really difficult territory, I think, in terms of justifying that under the law.
Do we have a... Thank you, Councillor, and we'll test it when we move. Do we have a seconder to move these recommendations as they are? A seconder, and Tom. Do you wish to speak first?
There's nothing much to say. Matter's been well canvassed. I believe it's got community support. It will be a difficult task to get something as comprehensive as this in place, but we should be starting where we're starting and try and get the best outcome we can out of the process.
Thank you, Alan. Tom?
Yeah, I'm pleased to see that we are being visited at this early stage by folks who would like to move in another direction. I'd like to see the issues sharpened as early as possible in this process. Hopefully the takeaway from a meeting like that or other discussions like that would be that we here in Hawke's Bay are pretty firmly resolved about what we would like to see happen or not happen in Hawke's Bay, whether it's the RMA or some other political outcome. So.
Are there any other speakers? I would also like to speak. I'd endorse both those previous speakers. We are on a course here. We knew that it would be controversial, the course, and we possibly knew that it would be litigated. But we're either going to make a stand here and not get intimidated by perceived threats or perceived arguments from outside our region or not. We either stand our ground or not. And there may be a cost to standing our ground, and we will face that, in my view, when that comes to it. But we have very strong community support on this, and I think that we should carry on, and I'm very pleased to see our mover and seconder. So if there's no other speakers, I would put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Do you want that recorded? I won't repeat twice. Thank you. Was said in jest, Councillor. Okay, thank you very much. I don't know what time lunch is, 12 o'clock, I guess, or it's been a long journey for the councillors if they've sat here since